Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Bob Cassidy built a pool on his property, he never expected it to spark a war with a power-hungry HOA. The threats escalated into sabotage, then a midnight invasion with an excavator. But Bob wasn't a man to be intimidated. If they came onto his land, they wouldn't be leaving on their own terms. Robert Bob Cassidy had spent years serving his country, enduring the harshest environments and the most grueling conditions. When he retired, all he wanted was peace, a place to call his own, where no one could dictate how he lived. That's why he chose this property, a sizable plot of land on the outskirts of a suburban neighborhood in Florida, far enough from the rigid rules of a homeowners association, but close enough to essential services. It was a place where he could finally relax, enjoy his privacy, and build the life he envisioned. For the first few years, everything went smoothly. Bob spent his days fixing up his home, working on his garden, and restoring the backyard into a personal retreat. The final touch was the small but beautifully designed pool he had built, a well-earned luxury after years of discipline and sacrifice. He followed every regulation, obtained all the necessary permits, and ensured everything was up to code. To him, the pool was a symbol of his hard work finally paying off, a place to cool off in the sweltering Florida heat, a sanctuary of his own making. However, the tranquility didn't last long. A letter arrived in the mail one afternoon bearing the official letterhead of the Maple Oak Homeowners Association. Bob frowned. He wasn't part of the HOA. He had deliberately chosen this property because it wasn't under their jurisdiction. Still, he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the carefully worded but unmistakably aggressive letter. The message was clear. His newly built pool was deemed an unauthorized structure that violated the aesthetic harmony of the community. The letter demanded that he remove it immediately or face substantial fines and legal consequences. Bob shook his head in disbelief. This had to be a mistake. His property had never been part of Maple Oak's HOA. He had checked when he purchased the land. Determined to put an end to this nonsense, Bob called the number listed on the letter. The voice on the other end belonged to Mark Walsh, the president of the HOA, a man whose tone oozed arrogance and authority. You should have consulted with the HOA before making such drastic modifications to your property, Mark said, his words slow and condescending. Bob's patience was thin. I don't need to consult you. My property isn't part of your HOA. There was a pause followed by a smug chuckle. That's where you're mistaken, Mr. Cassidy. Maple Oak's regulations apply to all homes in the surrounding area, whether they actively participate or not. This is about maintaining the standards of our community. If you refuse to comply, you'll be facing serious repercussions. Bob clenched his jaw. He knew a power-hungry bureaucrat when he heard one. This wasn't about community standards. It was about control. He hung up the phone and immediately called his lawyer, Michael Trent, a no-nonsense attorney who had dealt with countless HOA disputes before. After hearing the situation, Michael gave Bob two crucial pieces of advice. First, ignore their demands. Legally, they have no right to dictate what you do on your property unless there's a binding contract, which there isn't, Michael explained. Second, install security cameras around your home. If they're as aggressive as they sound, they might try something underhanded. Bob had dealt with threats before, but this time it wasn't enemy combatants. It was entitled Suburban Warriors in Golf Carts. Still, Michael's advice made sense. That same evening, Bob ordered a state-of-the-art surveillance system and installed cameras along the perimeter of his property. At first, it seemed like Mark and the HOA had backed off. No more letters arrived, no more calls came. But Bob knew better than to assume the battle was over. If there was one thing he had learned in his years of service, it was this. When the enemy goes silent, they're planning their next move. The silence didn't last long. A week after his heated conversation with Mark Walsh, Bob woke up to find a bright orange violation notice nailed to his fence. Final warning, immediate removal of unauthorized structure required. The wording was harsher than before, the threat of escalating fines now accompanied by a vague mention of further actions if he failed to comply. Bob ripped the notice down and tossed it aside. He wasn't about to be bullied off his own land. But this wasn't just about letters and threats anymore. That same day, Bob noticed a car parked across the street, its driver lingering too long, snapping photos of his property. It wasn't a neighbor. He recognized two men in polo shirts and khakis as HOA enforcers, self-important volunteers who acted as Mark Walsh's personal watchdogs. They made no effort to hide their surveillance, as if their mere presence was enough to intimidate him. Bob wasn't impressed. That evening, he checked the footage from his newly installed cameras. The same two men had been prowling around his property line for days, taking pictures from different angles. A few times, Mark Walsh himself had driven by, slowing down in front of Bob's driveway before continuing on. It was clear the HOA was building a case against him, trying to find anything they could use to claim authority over his land. Bob wasn't about to play their game. He called his lawyer, Michael Trent, and forwarded him the footage. Michael was unfazed. "They're fishing. They want to provoke you into reacting so they can claim you're being uncooperative or hostile. Don't engage. Just keep gathering evidence." Bob agreed, but the situation escalated faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, his water supply was mysteriously shut off. When he called the city, they told him it was due to an HOA request for maintenance in the area. Bob had never heard of an HOA having the power to do that, and when he demanded proof, the city workers seemed confused, but insisted they were following an official request. That same night, Bob heard the crunch of footsteps outside his house. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto his porch, sweeping the beam across his yard. The faint glint of a figure ducking behind his hedge sent his instincts into overdrive. "Hey!" he barked, stepping forward, but the trespasser was already sprinting away, disappearing into the night. Bob checked his cameras again. This time, he caught two masked figures sneaking onto his property, dumping garbage into his pool before bolting. It was a deliberate attempt to make it look unkempt, as if they were setting up grounds for another HOA violation. He wasn't going to let this slide. The next morning, he took the footage straight to the police. The officers watched the recordings with mild interest but were hesitant to act. "No real damage done," one of them said. "Might just be some neighborhood kids messing around." Bob knew better. This was Mark Walsh tightening his grip, testing how far he could push. By the end of the week, things got even worse. Another letter arrived, this one claiming that Bob's property value was now a detriment to the neighborhood. It was absurd. His house was pristine, his land well-maintained, and the pool was brand new. But the message was clear. They weren't going to stop until they forced him into submission. Mark Walsh even had the audacity to show up at Bob's property unannounced, standing just outside the gate with his arms crossed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Bob," he said smoothly. "If you just agree to remove the pool, we can put all this behind us." Bob took a slow step forward, his presence alone enough to make Mark shift uncomfortably. "Get off my land," Bob said flatly. Mark smiled, but it was strained. "Suit yourself," he muttered before turning away. That was it. Bob knew they were planning something bigger. The petty games were just the beginning. Whatever came next wouldn't be as subtle. They were preparing for war. The breaking point came at 2:47 a.m. The motion sensors around Bob's property triggered an alert on his phone, and a sharp mechanical rumble filled the air. He was out of bed in an instant, his instincts kicking in before his mind even processed what was happening. Throwing on a pair of boots, he grabbed his Remington 870 shotgun from its locked case and stepped onto the porch. What he saw made his blood boil. A construction crew, hired under the cover of darkness, had rolled a small excavator onto his property. 3 men in reflective vests were already at work, their boots sinking into the soft ground around his pool. One man was cutting into the concrete lining with a power saw, sending sparks flying, while another held a clipboard, barking orders. And standing a few feet away, watching with his usual smugness, was Mark Walsh himself. Bob tightened his grip on the shotgun, pumped a shell into the chamber, and stepped off the porch. "Drop the tools and get off my land!" The deep, authoritative boom of his voice froze the workers in place. The man with the power saw nearly lost his grip, the blade kicking up against the concrete with a loud screech before he let go entirely. The excavator driver hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls, his face pale under the harsh work lights. Mark, however, barely flinched. He smirked, taking a step forward. "Now, Bob, let's not do anything drastic. You're already in violation." Bob took 3 deliberate steps toward him, the shotgun leveling in Mark's direction. "I said, get off my property." That got their attention. One of the workers threw down his clipboard and bolted toward the street, his reflective vest flapping as he ran. The power saw operator wasn't far behind, mumbling something about not getting paid enough for this. Even the excavator driver jumped out of his seat and took off, leaving the machine idling in the middle of the torn-up lawn. Mark stood his ground, but Bob could see the way his hands twitched, the slight tremor in his breath. He was trying to maintain control, but his power trip was crumbling fast. "You're making a mistake," Mark hissed. "Threatening people with a firearm, that's a felony, Cassidy." Bob chuckled, a slow, dangerous sound. He took another step forward, forcing Mark to step back. "I'm well within my rights to defend my property from trespassers," Bob said. "And if you don't start running in the next 5 seconds, I'll make damn sure the next thing you hear is a blast ringing through your ears." Mark faltered, his cocky facade cracking. "You can't do this," he stammered, but he was already retreating. His polished loafers sank into the churned-up mud as he stumbled backward toward the street. "I'll have you arrested for this, you lunatic." Bob didn't say another word. He simply angled the shotgun slightly upward and fired a warning shot into the air. Boom! The deafening blast echoed through the neighborhood, sending birds scattering from the trees and porch lights flickering on up and down the block. That was all it took. Mark whipped around and ran, tripping over his own feet as he sprinted toward the safety of his car. He practically dove into the driver's seat, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he sped off. Bob exhaled slowly, lowering the shotgun. His property was a mess. His lawn was torn up. The edge of his pool was cracked from the power saw, and the excavator still rumbled idly in the wreckage. But his land was still his. He turned toward his security cameras, their red recording lights blinking steadily. Every second of what just happened was caught on tape. Let them try to spin this. Bob wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Bob stood in the wreckage of his yard, his breath steady, but his pulse hammering in his ears. The night was no longer silent. Neighbors had begun stepping onto their porches, their murmurs carrying through the air, mixing with the distant hum of crickets. Porch lights flickered on, illuminating stunned faces. The unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the stillness, growing louder by the second. He didn't move. He didn't need to. This was his land, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like he was the one in control. A convoy of police cruisers pulled up in front of his house, red and blue lights painting streaks across his damaged lawn. Officers poured out of their vehicles, hands on their holsters, scanning the scene. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, locked eyes with Bob and immediately recognized him. Cassidy. Officer Henderson stepped forward, his gaze flicking between the shotgun in Bob's hands and the abandoned construction equipment. "What the hell happened here?" Bob slowly uncocked the shotgun and slung it over his shoulder, his movements calm, deliberate. "Illegal trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property," he said evenly. And all of it was caught on tape. Before Henderson could respond, another car screeched to a halt behind the squad cars. Mark Walsh stumbled out, disheveled, his face red with fury. He marched toward the officers, pointing a shaking finger at Bob. "Arrest him. He fired a weapon at me. He threatened my life." Mark's voice cracked with rage, his confidence clearly rattled but not entirely broken. "This man is a menace. He's been resisting the Homeowners Association's authority for weeks, and now he's turned violent." Henderson turned back to Bob, his expression unreadable. "That true?" Bob didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward Henderson. "See for yourself." The officer watched in silence as the security footage played. Every second of the invasion was recorded. The construction crew rolling in, the men tearing into Bob's yard, Mark standing smugly as they tried to destroy the pool. Then came Bob's approach, his warning, his command for them to leave. And finally, the shot. Not at anyone, not even near them. Straight into the air, a clear warning to trespassers who had already been caught committing a crime. Henderson exhaled sharply. "Well, Mark," the officer said, his voice flat, unimpressed. "Looks like we got ourselves a case of criminal trespassing, property destruction, and filing a false police report." He tilted his head. "You want me to keep going?" Mark stiffened, his jaw working furiously. That footage is out of context. You don't understand. He's been a problem for months." Henderson held up a hand, silencing him. The only problem I see is a group of HOA goons trespassing on private property in the middle of the night and trying to destroy something that isn't theirs. He turned to the other officers. Cuff him. Mark's face drained of color. Wait! You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. Yeah? Henderson said as an officer yanked Mark's hands behind his back, snapping on the cuffs. Then maybe you should have spent more time reading the law instead of trying to bend it. As Mark was dragged toward the squad car, the neighbors murmured amongst themselves. Some of them had clearly sided with Mark before, but now they were seeing the truth with their own eyes. Bob watched in silence. He wasn't the type to revel in revenge, but damn if it didn't feel satisfying to see Mark finally answer for his actions. Henderson turned back to Bob. You pressing charges? Bob nodded. Every single one that applies. The legal battle that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. The moment Mark Walsh was booked for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and filing a false police report, the HOA tried to distance itself from him. Their official statement claimed that Mark had been acting independently and that the Maple Oak HOA had no prior knowledge of his actions. It was an obvious attempt to save themselves, but Bob and his lawyer, Michael Trent, were prepared for this exact maneuver. The first court hearing was set within a few weeks, and by that time Michael had gathered a mountain of evidence. Bob's security footage was the keystone of the case, but it wasn't the only weapon in their arsenal. Over the years, Mark had left behind a trail of harassment complaints, questionable fines imposed on homeowners, and blatant overreach of power. Several other residents of the neighborhood, ones who had previously been too afraid to speak, finally came forward. At the opening arguments, Mark's defense attorney tried to spin the narrative. Mr. Cassidy was aggressive and hostile from the beginning. My client was merely trying to enforce community standards, and unfortunately, things escalated. Michael didn't even blink. He stood, tapped the stack of documents on the table, and walked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice cool and confident. What you are about to see is not the story of a misunderstanding or a small dispute over a pool. What you are about to witness is a deliberate, calculated campaign of harassment orchestrated by an HOA president who believed he was above the law. With a nod to the bailiff, the first piece of evidence was displayed: the security footage. The jury's reaction was immediate. They watched as Mark and his crew invaded Bob's land in the middle of the night, as construction workers began destroying the pool, as Bob confronted them, and, most importantly, as he fired his shotgun harmlessly into the air while Mark fled like a coward. The prosecution's case was airtight. Michael followed up with witness testimony from Bob's neighbors, some of whom had been victims of the HOA's abusive fines and intimidation tactics. One elderly woman testified how Mark had threatened to foreclose on her home over an unapproved mailbox color. Another resident revealed that Mark had charged him thousands in fines for a minor fence repair that supposedly violated the aesthetic standard. The final nail in the coffin came when Michael presented emails from Mark to the HOA board, uncovered through a subpoena. These messages revealed that the board had been fully aware of the plan to destroy Bob's pool. In one email, Mark had even boasted, "Once Cassidy's pool is gone, he'll realize there's no fighting the HOA. By the time he figures out what's happening, we'll have buried him in so many fines that he'll have no choice but to sell." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even the most sympathetic jurors could see the truth now. This wasn't about neighborhood rules. This was a power play, a personal vendetta led by a man drunk on authority. Mark's defense crumbled. His attorney tried to negotiate a deal, but the judge wasn't interested. The final court ruling was severe. Mark was found guilty of trespassing, destruction of property, and filing a false report. He was sentenced to 6 months in county jail with additional financial penalties. The HOA was held liable for its involvement, forced to pay a 6-figure settlement to Bob for damages and legal fees. The court ordered a full financial audit of the HOA, uncovering years of corrupt practices and illegally collected fines. The Maple Oak HOA was officially dismantled. The moment the gavel struck, Bob let out a slow breath. It was over. But the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the whispers of the remaining HOA members, realizing that their unchecked power had finally met a wall named Bob Cassidy. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the community. The once feared HOA that had dictated every detail of homeowners' lives was now nothing more than a collapsed house of cards. Mark Walsh had been hauled off in handcuffs, sentenced to 6 months in county jail, and his reputation was beyond repair. The residents who had once blindly followed his leadership now avoided even saying his name. With the HOA legally dismantled, its funds seized, and years of fraudulent fines refunded, the neighborhood began to transform overnight. The remaining board members, now exposed as co-conspirators in Mark's corruption, either resigned or fled the community altogether. Without the fear of arbitrary fines, homeowners started reclaiming their properties. Bob watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just won for himself, he had won for everyone who had been bullied by the HOA's tyranny. But there was still one last thing to take care of. Bob hired a crew to repair the damage done to his land. Within a week, the torn-up soil was replaced, fresh concrete poured, and his pool restored to its former glory. But this time, he went even further, installing a 10-foot privacy fence around his property, complete with reinforced steel gates and motion-activated floodlights. No one, not another HOA, not another bureaucrat, would ever set foot on his land without his permission again. Despite the chaos of the past few months, the end result was better than he could have imagined. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood no longer had to live in fear. People started talking to one another again. Barbecues were hosted in backyards that had once been scrutinized for violating aesthetic standards. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now walked with confidence, knowing that they wouldn't wake up to a ridiculous violation notice on their door. Some even came to Bob's house to thank him personally. "We should have stood up to them years ago," one man admitted, shaking Bob's hand. "Mark had us all convinced we couldn't fight back," another said. "Guess we were wrong." Bob didn't need their gratitude, but he accepted it with a nod. He knew firsthand how easy it was to let fear dictate your actions, how people could be pressured into silence when they believed they had no power. That was what Mark had counted on, and that was why he had lost. The final blow to Mark came when his house was put up for sale. With his criminal record and ruined reputation, he had no choice but to leave the neighborhood in disgrace. The house that once stood as the HOA's power center now sat empty and unsold for months, a rotting symbol of a failed regime. On the day Mark officially moved out, Bob sat by his pool, sunglasses on, drink in hand, watching the moving trucks roll away. For the first time in months, his land felt like home again. There was no more HOA, no more threats, no more letters, just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had defended what was his and won. And if anyone ever tried to take it from him again, they'd learn the same lesson that Mark had. Bob Cassidy wasn't the kind of man you pushed around.